Wednesday, November 12th, 2014, and you're listening to Sin Boldly, the podcast
from the
past. Podcast, the Sign Your Name Project. I'm your host, Trey Comstock. With me this week, as ever, is Stephen Doss.
I'm so sorry.
On this week's show, we talk about the value of denominations in the midst of when things fall apart. In this week, it is a news show. So we'll go into more detail as we progress through talking about this, but let me give at least a basic overview. Mars Hill Church, the megachurch centered around the ministries of Mark Driscoll, will be closing its doors as of the end of the year. They are completely done. As some of y'all may know, Mark Driscoll, who is kind of the main figure associated with Mars Hill, had to resign recently. Is it you playing the music?
What music?
Okay, great. I'm going crazy. Wonderful. So he had to resign kind of over a long series of embarrassing things that came to light. Apparently he was a tremendous megalomaniac in terms of how he ran the church. He was consolidated power all in himself. He had, for many years, said very misogynist things under a pseudonym on the church's website. And that came out that he was doing it. And Mark Driscoll generally is kind of associated with a very bro-ish theology that is like, guys need to be stronger and women need to be obedient. And so he was a controversial figure for that, if anything else. And so he was put on kind of probation or suspension, and then basically said, okay, I'm done. And this was, I guess, earlier last month. And now, just a couple days ago, or yesterday even, this news story is dated the 7th of November. They announced that they're just closing the church. Since all the problems began, the church's attendance in between its main and satellite campuses had dropped from 12,000 to 6,000 people a week. Look, if I had 6,000 people a week coming to my church, I would be in great shape. Mm-hmm. There's mega churches have different problems than what I have. Giving had dropped off steeply, and it was basically they were done. So he was also accused of plagiarism and ripping ideas wholesale out of books. 14,000 to 6,000. So that they're framing this as a stewardship decision, and that to be the best stewards of their satellite locations, they are giving them local autonomy to decide to be independent churches or join on with other church networks, rather than being weighed down by the boat anchor that is the reputation of Mars Hill at this point. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the overview. Some of the progressive blogosphere is having their fun at mocking John Driscoll. John Talley tweets, when a pastor resigns and a church empire collapses almost overnight, you can almost be sure it wasn't built upon Christ, but another. Yep. So other people have been kinder, but... So, Stephen, kind of, what's your reaction? Obviously, theologically, we disagree with, or certainly I do, disagree with a lot of what Mars Hill stood for. But what strikes you about this?
Just the fact that one human can be so tied into a church that when he goes down, the church goes down with it. You hate to see, because... mega churches provide a need for some people. Their theology we might not agree with, but there are people that agree with it.
Well, it's hard to lump all mega churches together, right? Because you look at the Methodist mega church, you look at Church of the Resurrection, and a lot of their theology, it's a little too mobilized based on business philosophy for me, but a lot of what they're preaching is all right, is relatively
Yeah.
sound, at least looks relatively Methodist. So it's hard to lump all megachurches together. They do tend towards the Six Flags Over Jesus side
Yes.
of
Yes,
the
they
aisle.
do.
I mean, that is some of how you become a megachurch, I think.
Yeah, you provide a positive gain for the community in a business sense. Like,
Sure.
people want to go to that church because it's huge, it makes them feel good, yada, yada, yada. But the problem stems from the fact that it's not tied into, like, a church overall. Like, Mars Hill is non-denominational,
Right.
which means it's its own denomination.
Right.
And it was so tied into Mark Driscoll that when all that stuff, the church fell with him. There was no transition. There was no someone to take the place. They didn't have someone waiting in the wings to say, all right, this is your baby now. Here's the theology behind it. Here's how you can make it grow. Rather, it was just like, Mark Driscoll, we don't have a pastor.
Right. And I think, when a pastor's getting too old, you're able to kind of raise up a successor, right? And very much, the analogy I used before the show is kind of medieval royalty, right? You can have a successor waiting in the wings. You can this is what happened at the Yaibo, the largest church in the world, the one with 800,000 people in Korea.
Is that a Mooney church?
I don't know.
The Moonites or whatever they're called.
It's Pentecostal. It's vaguely Pentecostal. It's Korean Pentecostal. It's a non-dom. God, what is it called? Yaibo. This should get it.
Oido Full Gospel Church.
Yeah. So they,
and it's Assemblies of God.
Like I said, didn't I say Pentecostal? Assemblia de Dios. So it's a Pentecostal church, but like they had their kind of, big leader guy who was kind of the main impetus behind getting the church going, but he was able to successfully raise up one of his associates into kind of now the big leader guy, and they kind of are able to share the stage now that the original pastor is way too old to be running the thing day to day. And so I think when he passes on, that church will be able to continue because they've built something that's somewhat sustainable. Like I said, this is not... They are able to withstand this stuff when it is an expected succession, like aging out. Where it seems to get tougher is when it's caused by scandal. That they don't have something to fall back on. Because it is, a lot of these churches, and certainly your Joel Osteen ministries and your Mark Driscolls of the world are kind of these core personalities. You can look at Andy Stanley here in Atlanta. You can look at a lot of these and there was in the article in the Atlantic that I read about this, one of the things they said is that what tied all the satellite locations together was that one sermon by Mark Driscoll. Mm-hmm. That was the uniting thing for these churches. Wasn't that they were part of a denomination, or wasn't that they were, participating in the body of Christ or whatever. I guess to a certain extent they're doing that too, but that the uniting thing is the words spoken by Mark Driscoll. Mm-hmm. And when that went away, the impetus and the reason behind that church also went away.
Right.
And so one of the locations is confirmed will close. One of them will go independent. And kind of people are left kind of homeless.
Yeah. And that's the problem with the cult of personality. Mm-hmm. It's what, in all honesty, the closest thing I could think of was North Korea. I know it's a horrible analogy, but it's apt. It's apt.
Sure. On a certain level.
Yeah, it's this one person who is basically the guy. The world revolves around him. Sadly, It's not Jesus. It's Mark Driscoll. And when he goes and there's not a successor, the country, the state, the church falls into chaos.
Sure. And, to a certain extent, religious movements, for good and for ill, are often drilled back to one person, right? In our own denomination of Methodism, there is a certain cult of personality that remains around Wesley. We take Wesley's words as normative, in very real doctrinal ways. And we have, in sometimes a way overinflated view of who Wesley was and, how he continues to impact us. A high-powered Methodist traveling companion of mine once said that, we walk in the way of Christ in the company of the Wesleys. That's what Methodist theology is, which that's a construction that I worry about. And I think John might have worried about too, that, kind of putting him there right alongside Christ is a little troubling. But it withstood the death of Wesley, partly because, specifically in the United States, it took off and took on a life of its own with other leadership.
Right.
Particularly Asbury, but others.
Yeah, there was someone there who could take over. With this one, there's not. By the way, just reading about Uito Full Gospel Church, did you know that in January of 1986, they built a city for the elderly, young, homeless, and unemployed?
I did.
And they gave every unemployed person a job.
I did know that, actually.
Which is kind of awesome.
We talked about it in a worship class I'm taking. And it's a fascinating story. They've built hospitals. They've, combated childhood diseases. They are investing in small churches in rural areas that aren't being reached real well right now. It's not all, mega church does not necessarily have to mean this total abandonment of theology in the sake of personality. Not every church is Joel Osteen, right? And even, I think even Mark Driscoll's theology was certainly much more orthodox or much more realistic, or at least much more overtly Christian theology than Joel. There's a thin line between Joel Osteen and Oprah Winfrey, right? And I actually would rather, Oprah is just kind of honest about what she's doing, and Joel isn't. But, I've brought this up in the show before, but I remember walking into Lakewood Church, and there's not a cross in there. There's not a cross in that sanctuary.
There's a globe.
There's the Joel Osteen logo.
Yeah.
Which is the lamb and the globe and I don't know. It was a thing. It's a
that's because the cross isn't happy. It's depressing. Christ died. We don't remember that because it makes us feel bad.
Right. But again,
we can't live our best life now.
But
if we're remembering that Christ is the ultimate example of self-sacrificial giving.
Right. What's interesting is, so I am deeply in the middle of reading Bonhoeffer's Ethics, which is a wonderful but dense volume. And literally, the core argument of ethics is that in Jesus you are your best self.
Yeah.
It's like the core argument of ethics is that in living the life with Christ is the fullest embrace of your humanity, is a life grounded in Christ. That it's not a rejection of the human, but a radical acceptance of the human, and a reconciliation and a redemption of the human. That's led Joel to sell books. That led Bonhoeffer to die in a concentration camp. Something gets lost in the middle there. The gospel, I think, is what gets lost. I think
that's what gets lost there.
In the middle there. So, what I wonder with it, kind of coming back to Driscoll, I always want to talk about Joel, clearly. This is what does this say about the value of denominations in a modern world?
Well, it does provide a basis, a good argument for denominationalism, because let's say this wasn't Mars Hill, this was Mars Hill United Methodist Church.
Well, let's say this is Church of the Resurrection. Let's take a Methodist megachurch.
And the pastor there is like, okay, I'm done.
So Adam Hamilton leaves Church of the Resurrection.
We have processes in place to say, like, okay, guess what, Adam Hamilton, you're gone, but this person's taking over.
Right.
Because that's just the way itinerancy works. That's just the way being in a denomination works. Same thing if you were Southern Baptist. Yes, it's more congregationalist, but the Southern Baptist Convention can say, okay,
or your local deacons can
Or
say,
your local-
okay, you have, we have these kind of very set rules. This church is, even if you're the founding pastor, I mean, this happens all the time, that Baptist preachers get let go and the deacons work together to bring in someone new.
Exactly.
There are denominational resources and kind of a polity, whether loose or in the Methodist Church, highly structured,
yeah.
that kind of deals with this process. Now, mega churches are often seen as kind of the counterpoint to denominations. The denominations are shrinking while mega churches are growing or swelling, right?
Right.
That really, they like to make the claim that they are reaching the unchurched, and I'm sure on a certain level that is true. But I think a lot of what I see happening,
But they're reaching the unchurched with unchurch,
right, or they
or
are
untheology.
taking people from churches and moving them to the unchurches.
Yeah.
And that is some of what's killing off our small to medium-sized churches. Is exactly that. Is the robbing from the large churches and the mega churches. But they're often seen as the counterpoint to denominations because, quite frankly, they're growing, denominations are shrinking. And some of it is that lack of institutional baggage and that they can move quickly and that they can take whatever form fits. And so...
Yeah, they don't have to make sure they're attending to a certain theology, a certain set of rules, because
right. Or
there's none for them.
There's no rules. There's also no baggage. There's no institutional holdups. They're not worrying about charge conference and kind of all the rearranging the deck chairs that is in the life of the Methodist Church. Or Methodist Church is my own perspective, but like large denominational structures have their own essence of deck chair, right? Like that's a part of it. But then there's also no accountability. Right? Like, no one called Mark out years ago.
Right.
There wasn't a district committee on ordained ministry that could, that's plagiarism, or you're not running your church in an appropriate way. You're just consolidating power. There's not a book of discipline or a set polity on how a church is to be organized so that it can't just be all condensed in the senior pastor. That there is, in the Methodist Church, we have a, SPRC, a staff parish relations committee that helps manage and make sure the pastor it isn't just about the pastor. There are resources that are provided by these denominations that allow you to handle with when things go awry. When things are going well, who cares? Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, do what you want. Everything's going well.
But you don't have anything to fall back on.
Yeah.
And so it feels like in this move to megachurch and the rise of the undenomination, I stopped thinking it was a non-denomination. It's an undenomination. It's trying very deliberately to undo the denomination. And there's a Methodist megachurch just south of here in Atlanta that doesn't even allow all people to take communion. That they've cast aside that aspect of this denomination because it didn't fit with their theology. And somehow they're getting away with it, which is fascinating.
Which is a chargeable offense, so we should bring them up on charges.
Oh, speaking of bringing up on charges, at 6 p.m. today, this is totally unrelated, but I think it's worth throwing out there. At 6 p.m. today, a couple, I believe it was in North Carolina, are charging their minister with not performing their gay wedding or not performing their lesbian wedding. That they're bringing their pastor up on charges for not performing a wedding for them. That on grounds that I think that then they're not being pastored to.
Yeah.
So let me get at least some of these details right. North Carolina. I thought that was really fascinating.
That's pretty, for lack of a better word. That's pretty awesome.
No, here's the line. North Carolina gay couple filed complaint against pastor for not officiating wedding. Now, if that doesn't, that is going to be an interesting trial because, obviously there's, with Schaefer, there was been a lot of buzz around prosecutions for performing. Just like a few years ago, the big deal was prosecutions because the pastor themselves was a practicing homosexual. That's died down, and now it's the witch hunt of who's been doing the gay marrying. And so to turn that on its head and subvert it, that's real clever. I shout out to them. That's pretty cool. Any final thoughts on the Driscoll affair before we get out of here?
Nope. I think we pretty much covered it all, and it's pretty sweet. It's a shame for all those people who that was their church home, and now they have to go find another one. But
at the same time,
that's one of the risks you take with a megachurch.
Especially a megachurch so wrapped in and deliberately wrapped in the personality of
in
its
one
founder.
person.
Yeah.
Megalomania is a horrible thing.
And it damages people and it damages churches. In whatever form, whether in a denomination or not. But a non-denomination, I think, just doesn't have the checks and balances that help protect you when things go wrong. So on that really cheerful note, it's time to end. Thank you so much for joining us for this kind of slightly compressed edition of Sin Boldly. If you have any feedback for us, sinboldly@endfear.org, facebook.com/the Sign Your Name Project, or at Sin Boldly, that's SYN Boldly on Twitter. And go in peace to love and serve the Lord and end fear by signing your name. Good night. Also, Mark Driscoll clearly spent too much money on his hair. It's always about the hair with me.
That's where the $25 million went.